Hi, I'm Richard Friedman, and welcome to my video cartoon for November 28th, 2025. Hope you all had a good Thanksgiving yesterday, folks, and we're ready to go today. And here we are, have another cartoon video for you. And here we're starting off here with, this was President Trump at on October 13th, 2025, at following a U.S. brokered Gaza ceasefire. So this is right after the ceasefire, and this is important to bring it into perspective, all the events that have happened since then and what's happening now. And I'm just giving you an overview here, starting with this first cartoon here. And here is President Trump here in front before the Knesset in Israel, right after the ceasefire was brokered by the United States. And here he is. And he's saying, "I want to thank my friend, Steve Witkoff. You know, Steve was chosen by me. He never did this before, but I knew he was a great businessman with tremendous negotiating skills. But most importantly, Steve is just a great guy, and everybody loves him. I set up a meeting between Steve and Putin in Moscow, thinking it would go 15 or 20 minutes. You know, somebody else, Putin would just throw out the door immediately, but not Steve. Steve was there on the right, and not Steve. And so I called up after 1 hour, 2 hours, he still had it, 3 hours, 4 hours, finally after 5 hours, okay? And this was on the Russia-Ukraine war, you see? It took 5 hours. When it finally ended, Steve said, "We were talking about a lot of interesting things. I call him my Henry Kissinger, but who does not leak like Henry? But who does not leak like Henry Kissinger?" He doesn't, in other words, he calls him Henry Kissinger without the leaks. Oh, Henry was a big leaker. Let me tell you, Henry was a big leaker. So he was reflecting on Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was President Richard Nixon's Secretary of State and also National Security Advisor, I think, for another president, or perhaps even both. I'm not sure, but I know he was Secretary of State, and I know he was at one point also National Security Advisor. Okay, so President Richard Nixon relied on him plenty to end that Vietnam War, which was ended. So, well, I'm not going to dwell into that here. So what I'm trying to give you here is a perspective, you know, on what happened here. So this was October 13th. Now, on October 14th, this is when the thing happened where now President Trump, in his other talk here, I paraphrased it, clearly stated that Steve Witkoff would now turn his full attention to addressing the Russia-Ukraine war. And so, as a result, the next day, this phone call was made where Steve Witkoff, in conversation with President Putin's envoy, his counterpart, let's say, in President Putin's envoy, and he was President Trump's envoy, his counterpart, he said basically that there was a way he kind of coached this envoy into telling President Putin how to approach President Trump in terms of getting him to agree with his 28-point peace plan. That basically, it has to be assumed here that what happened was that Witkoff and this Russian envoy together, both of them, even though there was some peripheral involvement with Jared Kushner and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the thrust of this agreement, you have to assume, was made by this Russian envoy and Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy. You have to assume that from this whole scenario. So he advised them how to go ahead about presenting this. You got to congratulate President Trump on how he got the ceasefire for Gaza. He brought about the ceasefire, and that he was a man of peace, and you respect him very much, and smooth that over, and from there everything will go great. Basically, Witkoff was recorded as saying to this Russian envoy. You see, so with that's in mind. Now the thing here is President Trump has always said that if he had been president instead of Biden, the war never would have been fought, then would not have been a war. But I'm not trying here. I'm trying to, more than this, I'm trying to give you a perspective here as to where Putin is coming from. Not to justify it, but to give you an understanding of how he perceives himself as some sort of a czar, of a 2025 czar. He's not the czar, but he perceives himself in that respect, and also in terms of the other people who, historical figures, who he feels a closeness to, like Peter the Great. Now Peter the Great here, he was ruled from 1682 to 1725. Peter the Great, and he was the one who got the Russia to the country of Russia to be a power on the European continent, and took it away from Sweden. But when they kicked the Swedes out of Ukraine and took over some things that the Swedes had, and that was beginning the downfall of Sweden, of the Swedish control there, was the beginning of Russia being a power on the European continent. So Peter the Great started the ball rolling there. And then came, I took these notes, Catherine the Great came about 35 or so years later, and she went in and took Crimea and some of the land that we see here today. I showed you last time on a thing in that eastern part of the country. She came in there and took that land, and she took Crimea. That was Catherine the Great. And how it's very interesting that Catherine the Great became the Tsar she basically kicked out her husband as Tsar. Her husband was Peter the Third, and Peter the Third was no Peter the Great, obviously. So she thought he wasn't strong enough, so she got the military to support her, and she kicked out. She kicked out like boot him out of the. I don't mean it like that, but figuratively speaking, she took control and became Catherine the Great, the Tsar of Russia. And again taking back much of Ukraine, the Crimea, and the Eastern Territory we talked about last time in my map that I showed you. So that was Catherine the Great. And then he doesn't think much. President Putin doesn't think much of Khrushchev because Khrushchev backed down during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was too soft, and he spoke, and Khrushchev spoke against. He spoke against Joseph Stalin, the man of steel. Stalin means steel. He spoke against him. Khrushchev did, and Khrushchev, the greatest sin of all was giving back Crimea to Ukraine after what Catherine the Great had done and everything like that. Khrushchev gave back Crimea to Ukraine. So Khrushchev is not one of President Putin's favorites. You're sure of that. And Mikhail Gorbachev, he was probably the least of them all because President Putin blames him for the fall of the Soviet Union, and he was too nice with the West and too friendly, and that was a big mistake, which led to the fall of the Soviet Union, which President Putin views as the greatest tragedy of that century. So there you have it. This is a man who has a strong foundation in his thinking, and it's not going to be any one personality or anything that's going to change that. Everything is Russian advancement and Russian, bringing back the Soviet Union and the way it's supposed to be. And he sees Ukraine as violating like Ukraine is his backyard, and they're in his backyard now. And it's his backyard. That's how Putin sees this. So calling him names, calling him this, calling him that, don't mean anything because it's his backyard that's being violated in his thinking. And so there's not going to be any kind of diplomacy that's going to. The only thing is Putin has to see that it's better for Russia to make some concessions to Ukraine. It has to be better really on the ground in terms of territory and military and this and that. It has to be better for Russia, you see. And if it's not better for promoting the Russian return of the Soviet Union, if it's not better for promoting the return of the Soviet Union, then it's no deal. It has to be moving in that direction, not slowly but surely, okay? So that's that. So again, I read you this here. This was President Trump before the Knesset. And again here, given President, and I wrote this down to show you what happened here with Witkoff, given President Donald Trump's main special envoy with the Russian government, Steve Witkoff, according to a transcript of the October 14th published call, advised Putin's foreign policy advisor that Putin should call Trump to congratulate him for the Gaza peace deal and say Russia had supported it and that he respects the president as a man of peace. See that? With Witkoff saying, according to the transcript, from that it's going to be a really good call. So he's really, what Witkoff is doing here is he's coaching indirectly through a conduit. He's coaching President Putin. And you have to assume here, again, that this deal was formulated by Witkoff and this very envoy from President Putin. So the envoy and Witkoff, the envoy from Putin and Witkoff, the envoy from Trump, put this deal together, and that Jared Kushner in this case and Marco Rubio were like side dishes there. They were the main course, and they were the thrust of how this thing was put together. You have to assume that. I mean, you don't have to, but in my opinion, you do. Okay? From that, it's going to be a really good call. And U.S. Representative Don Bacon, a Nebraska Republican. Now, he ain't not from New York, no liberal from New York City. He's no liberal Democrat from New York City. He's Representative Don Bacon, a Nebraska Republican, who has been critical of Trump's approach to Ukraine, said, would a Russian paid agent do less than Witkoff? In other words, Witkoff is acting like a Russian agent in this case. He should be fired. That's what he said. That amid President Trump and Russian President Putin defending Witkoff against accusations of pro-Russian bias, with Putin calling Witkoff, quote, an intelligent man. And Trump saying Special Envoy Steve Witkoff did the standard thing, doing what a dealmaker does to sell the plans to both Russia and Ukraine. So President Trump sees Witkoff as doing his job here, trying to make the deal. It's a transactional thing. There's no President Trump is a transactional deal maker. He doesn't see things in terms he sees things in terms of that moment in time, not the ramifications of before or after promises, this and that. He sees it at that moment, at the advantage of that moment. And then after that, it's goodbye, Charlie. It's all, that's done. It's gone. But at that moment, it's a transaction. And that's the way President Trump sees it. So in this case, he sees what Witkoff did as a deal maker. He did what he had to do to make the deal in a super pragmatic way. Okay? So there you have that. All right, and then we go back here. This is President Trump there. Okay. And here we have, this is the ghost of former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger coming back to the Oval Office here and haunting Trump. He got a little upset at President Trump calling him a big leaker, and what's going on here, because he don't think he ever would have done that with Lee Duc-Tho when he was negotiating an end to the Vietnam War. When Lee Duc-Tho was negotiating for the North Vietnamese. So here he is, and President Reagan here isn't too happy with either. He's not smiling like he usually does in the Oval Office here. President Reagan ain't too happy with that. There he is, frowning a little bit about this situation. I did that. President Reagan there, not too happy in a way. I took the liberty of doing that. I don't think he would be happy with that. Okay, so here is the ghost of President Nixon. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger returns to White House amid given President Trump on October 13th. This is on October 13th, before the Knesset in Israel. Trump had referred to his envoy to the Gaza ceasefire talks, Steve Witkoff, as his Henry Kissinger without the leaks, saying, "Okay, Henry was a big leaker. Henry was a big leaker," Trump said. Okay. So here goes the dialogue between the ghost of Henry Kissinger and President Trump. Okay, and President Trump, and here's Henry Kissinger landing on that yellow chair, coming down here, and there he goes, landing here. There's Henry Kissinger, and he's saying here, President Trump, there's Henry Kissinger, President Trump, there is no comparison between me and your Russian envoy, who you have praised for the Gaza ceasefire deal. Steve Witkoff. There's no comparison between me and Witkoff. I got peace with honor and never advised North Vietnam's Lee Duc-Tho on how to get a good deal from President Nixon. You see? So again, President Trump here has kind of lifted Witkoff up on the stage for the ceasefire Gaza agreement. The ceasefire, which is a big thing, because Israel was pounding that Gaza Strip. They were pounding, and now the people in Gaza are getting a reprieve here, and a little help, and so forth. So that was a big thing. There's no taking away from that. Okay. And I was awarded. So Henry Kissinger goes on, and I was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for my efforts to end that Vietnam War. Okay, and I never advised North Vietnam's Lee Duc-Tho, the leader of North Vietnam, the negotiator, or I don't know if he was the leader or the negotiator for North Vietnam, on how to get a good deal from President Nixon. Okay, so he never advised that that Kissinger was negotiating with Lee Duc-Tho to end the Vietnam War, and he never advised him how to approach any kind of plan that they came up with to go back to President Nixon with. He never did that. So then Kissinger goes on and says, I was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for my efforts to end that Vietnam War. He did get the Nobel Peace Prize. Henry Kissinger got it for ending the Vietnam War. That was a terrible thing. I went through that. I was in school trying to get those grades, keeping those grades high. If you flunked out or had a bad semester, boom, you were drafted. A lot of college kids got drafted because they couldn't hold their grades. And I tell you, those professors didn't have any mercy. You had a total line in that city college, or you were out the door. I had a friend who flunked out, and they just that was it. He went over there, and I lost track of him, but I hope he's around today and doing well. But anyway, that was it. There was no mercy. You had to hang on to that college deferment. And I have to say this though. At the beginning, I was very much in favor of the Vietnam War, and then down the road, I saw the futility of fighting in the jungle and all these things like this. Bill Jorgensen every night on Channel 5 in New York City doing the honor roll of kids like myself getting killed. I mean, it was really something. It was really something. Nothing like going there to fight the war, for sure, but it was something. Okay. And then Henry saying that Henry Kissinger had quite a big ego, and he was saying I was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize again for my efforts to end that Vietnam War. And President Trump here, he retorts back and says this, Henry, that's bullshit. I ended 8 wars, and I want that Nobel Peace Prize for me, not Witkoff. President Trump don't want Witkoff to get no Nobel Peace Prize. He wants that Nobel Peace Prize for himself. Okay? And then here goes Henry Kissinger, and here he is here, and he's saying this. Henry Kissinger retorts back to President Trump saying, Here he is there. Here he is. You get a close-up on Henry there. You see, there he is. He's getting up from his chair. He's about to get up. And he says, President Trump, I have to take a big leak now. I have to take a big leak now. So he's kind of joking around, President Trump, with that. President Trump, I have to take a big leak now. Good luck with Putin. So he's out there. He's out that office there saying he's got to take a big leak. There he goes. I've got to take a big leak. He goes and playing around with President Trump, calling him that. And that's his retaliation there. Getting up to say how he has to take a big leak and leaving and going back upstairs. There he goes. All right, folks. Thank you for watching my video. God bless you. Hang in there. And I'll see you next time. Bye.